I would like to call this meeting to order and recognize the commissioners that are present. President Lopez, Vice President Lamb, Student Delegate Lamb. Thank you so much for all being here. And with that, why don't we start with our first and only item and begin with the presentation. And I'll pass it to staff to lead that.
Thank you, Commissioner Bogus. My name is Myung Lee. I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Policy and Operations for the district, and I am going to be joined in presenting the staff information by Joseph Bernardo, the Technical Project Manager for this aspirational project, and Mauricia Robinson, the Community Engagement Manager. So we'll each share some of the presenting duties, and want to note I'm usually in the background for these meetings for my part, and standing in, joining the team in place of Orla O'Keefe, our Chief of Policy and Operations, who this is a very important project for her. She loves this project, but she has a family obligation. So I'm understudying for Ms. O'Keefe tonight. So I will be giving just a little bit of background, and commissioners, I know you have heard some of this before, but just to provide a bit of a frame.
Can I ask a question before you get started?
Certainly.
Would it be okay for commissioners and student delegates with clarifying questions to raise their hands on that particular slide and ask them there? We'll maybe ask folks to limit it to one per, just so that we can go directly into public comment after the presentation.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Commissioner Bogus. I would say that will work fine for us. And I'll add that we've inserted kind of pause for question and discussion slides at regular intervals, like every 2 to 5 slides throughout the deck. So we can use those as opportunities for discussion. But in addition to that, I think we would invite you to raise your hands and ask questions as we're going through the content.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. So Mr. Steele, if we could project the slides, thank you. And if we could go to, yes, so that's our names for anyone who doesn't know the three of us. And then if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So just to provide a bit of context, as commissioners know, these meetings are part of a years-long strategy discussion about SFUSD's student assignment policy. And the focus for this year is implementing the new zone-based assignment policy, which the Board of Education passed in December of 2020. And as with previous meetings, we approach all of these meetings of the ad hoc committee as working sessions. In other words, our chance to have conversations with the board, with the committee, to hear your thinking and to collaborate in real time and in public. And they've been very substantive discussions, which our team really appreciates. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. So just to remind everyone about the why this work is being undertaken in the first place. And again, this is something that our team reminds everyone of in these committee meetings, but just to say it again, this work exists because we see that there's an opportunity and a need in our district to address problems that currently exist under our current assignment system, which has resulted in segregated schools, and we don't think that's an acceptable outcome. Our current system places a burden on our families to consider more than 70 elementary schools when they enter the district, which also causes stress and anxiety for families. It promotes a disconnect between schools and the communities closest to them, and it has resulted in under-enrollment at some of our schools. In other words, under the current policy, we have bad outcomes that impact our district as a whole, especially specific schools and neighborhoods and individual families and students. On the right side of the slide, you can see some of the guiding values underlying the new policy. Next slide, please. So for tonight, these are our specific topics for tonight. We definitely invite commissioners to participate, as Commissioner Bogus mentioned, to participate throughout our presentation and ask questions as we go. And as Joseph said, we'll plan to pause at the end of each section to hear your thoughts and questions related to each topic. So you can see all the topics in the color-coded bullet points. And then we can go to the next slide, Mr. Steele. So specifically, we have 3 objectives for this meeting. One is we want to share part of the approach to evaluating maps of draft zones. We want to reiterate the theory of action and spend some time thinking about the universe of system shifts that will be required to make it true. And finally, to bring awareness to some of the important conversation topics that we're thinking about. So that last question is fairly broad, and you'll see what we mean by that when we get to that section. So with that, I'm going to pass to Joseph to go through the next section.
Thank you, Myung. All right, well, hello, commissioners and members of the public. Really appreciate you all joining us this evening. So I am going to start with a section that is about working definitions and our current phase of zone evaluation, and really just want to give you an update on what we've been working on in recent weeks and in recent days and in the few days to come. So this is really like a real-time update of part of the work we're doing. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so the image on the left might look familiar to any of you who participated in previous ad hoc committee meetings. We've talked about an iterative approach that we're taking to zone development and evaluation. So we know that we can set some rules, that we can kind of give to a computer that generates different maps for us based on those rules. So based on kind of the priorities that we're setting, we're able to get draft maps that then we're able to evaluate and consider, as staff, working across multiple departments, and in these meetings and with members of the public in various settings. So that's kind of the iterative cycle that we've been on for the last several weeks, and that will continue to be on for the next few months as we work toward zone, a new zone-based student assignment policy. On the right-hand side of the screen, I'm presenting kind of another view and a different view of how that process works, because I think that the iterative description about us kind of working around, in that feedback loop is helpful in some sense, but want to offer this additional view that kind of describes how we're moving down this filter. As we set rules that lead us to maps that give us elementary school zones for a new student assignment system, there's a need to kind of identify the ones that are closest, that are most closely fitting our needs and our desires for the new system, and kind of continue to add in additional layers and additional nuance to the evaluation. So on the right, you can see there are kind of 3 phases of the evaluation described here. And the first is to identify maps that meet our policy goals. Our student assignment policy that the board passed in 2020 has 3 explicitly named goals of diversity, proximity, and predictability. So as we're starting to look at maps in different zone configurations, we want to make sure that we have a clear way of understanding and communicating and being confident in the map's ability to achieve those 3 goals. Kind of in addition to meeting the policy goals, we know that this change will have big implications for SFUSD as a whole district. And we want to be able to project the impact on different aspects of how departments in SFUSD operate. And that sounds like very bureaucratic, but really it's really important for us to bring a lens to the operational impact, because this is about like how families are experiencing the district, right? It has to do with how families can get access to their schools every morning and to get home every afternoon. It has to do with how our schools are funded and resourced, how families are able to access different programs that they care about. And then finally, of course, we want to make sure throughout the process, and especially later this spring in virtual and in-person workshops, that we're able to respond to community voice throughout zone evaluation. And so really that's about us making sure that we're hearing clearly from families what would work for them and what we as a district need to work to ensure to make the map that we're ending up with be a welcome and good outcome for families and for the district. Okay, that's kind of like a phased approach of how we'll be continuing through zone evaluation. And we can move to the next slide, and I'll spend a little bit more time kind of describing this first phase, which again is really where we are most deeply engaged right now. Although I think it's fair to say we're kind of thinking and doing all three of these phases right now. But in this first phase, I talked about the need and the desire to identify maps that are meeting our 3 policy goals. In order to do that, we're using working definitions, which are just kind of like rules that we as staff have developed as a way to help us identify in a consistent manner which maps are achieving those 3 policy goals. So again, I'm calling them working definitions, but really it's just a consistent set of criteria that we can use to determine whether or not draft zone maps satisfy our 3 goals. And I'll reiterate, this is just one part of the strategy. We're working toward finding the right map for SFUSD and for San Francisco families. The value of these working definitions is that they can help us refine the list of potential map options, so we can focus in on the ones that are achieving our 3 goals. And then with kind of that subset of maps, we're able to do more focused, nuanced evaluation that brings kind of more clarity to the operational impact and to the impact on families and students. And so we can move to the next slide. And here I'm sharing draft versions of the working definitions that we're using currently. The purpose of sharing these with the board and the public right now is to try and communicate a sense of what this current phase of the evaluation looks like and includes. So again, I'll emphasize these are draft definitions. You can see there are some placeholders in the slide, and these are subject to change based on feedback that we hear tonight, but also based on learning that we're doing every day. And I said at the start of this presentation, like this is an update on work that's happening real time. So every day we're learning things that help us kind of refine these working definitions and refine our approach in other ways, so that we can bring kind of that better informed perspective as we continue to develop and evaluate draft maps. Okay, so with all of that framing, I'll just speak through the content that's on the slide. So you can see the working definitions kind of are mapped on top of, line up against our 3 policy goals. And let me turn on a light in my room. I realize I've gotten kind of dark.
And if we could kindly request panelists to make sure you're on mute except for the speaker, it'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. Okay, so I'll start with diversity, our first policy goal, the highest priority policy goal named in the board policy. So we know that it's important for the district to have a set of elementary school zones that promote diversity. So as we're generating maps, we want to be able to see whether or not our maps are giving us zones that are representative of district characteristics. So we're checking how representative each map is of those district characteristics And we're really focused on 5 characteristics that are named in the board policy around what it means for a zone to be diverse. So you can see those listed here, but it's free and reduced price lunch eligibility, race and ethnicity, English proficiency, disability, and academic performance. So within this diversity rectangle still, you can see that on the slide, the text says we want to be able to compare our new zones to the current enrollment of schools within each zone. We want to compare the representativeness and diversity that might exist within our new zone to the representativeness of schools in that area currently. We're also at the same time exploring what we can learn about how diverse our new zones are by comparing many different map solutions to each other. So we're generating these maps. For each map, we're able to get a measure of how representative it is of district characteristics. We can compare those to each other to identify maps that are kind of on the high end of diversity outcomes versus those that are on the low end. And so I kind of described 2 alternate approaches. One that is comparing zones to kind of an estimate of the status quo level of diversity in the district, and another that isn't attempting to do that. I'll say the kind of in that first bucket where we would compare zones to a status quo, the comparisons between what we're working toward and trying to use measures of school enrollment currently don't line up perfectly, and might not actually give us the best view of how diverse our new zones are. Okay, so that's diversity. And I'll move to proximity. There are 3 things that we're checking for every map related to proximity. And the first is how many options students have close to their house. The second is how far away the farthest school is from students within their zone. And the third is the extent to which we're able to preserve students and families' walking access to school. And then predictability. The first point is obvious, but I think it is important for us to state it. One way that we're making sure our maps are promoting predictability is that they're reducing the overall number of potential options and outcomes for each applicant, right? And so all of our maps are going to do that because we're introducing zones, moving from district-wide choice to city-wide choice. And again, although that is obvious, I think it's kind of important for us to show our work about how our policy design and implementation is connected to our policy goals. And then the second way that we're kind of checking for predictability is by checking how well the capacity in each zone can fit the students who live in that area. Because if we're not able to do that, then we really lose the benefits of zones when it comes to predictability. So I'm at the end of this section. There's a prompt on the next slide that says, what changes or additions do you suggest? But I'm happy to field any questions on kind of this summary of the evaluation process right now.
I guess, yeah, why don't we check in with commissioners and see if they have a response to the question on the slide or clarifying questions at this point. Okay, let me make sure that I can see all of my fellow commissioners. I have one while I look. I'm curious how we are taking desirability kind of into effect, like the schools that people are applying for kind of the most in this moment, kind of separate from enrollment and some of those other questions. I think one thing I'm interested in is how will families still have access to the schools that they view as their number one choice as we kind of switch from this? And specifically, like if in which zones are those schools in, and kind of is there any kind of imbalance in that in kind of geography or demographics kind of for the city?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Commissioner Bogus. I'll give a brief response. You know, it's we've received similar questions, and it's something that we've spent a good bit of time thinking about. And I think we're striving to find the right balance between making sure that every family is confident that within their new zone, they're getting access to the type of experience that they want for their students. And we realize that one way families might do that is based on their conceptions of like what experiences exist at each school today. But we're trying to balance that with kind of a vision for the future about how those positive, desirable experiences exist in every zone in every school. And in coming slides, we'll kind of talk about like how we see that vision and what it will take to get us there. But we recognize that is a relevant and important question.
Okay, I think seeing no more questions or comments, why don't we keep going forward?
Okay, before I pass it off to the next section, I'll just take a minute to reiterate that the working definitions that I just talked through are like, again, just a real-time message to you all about what we're doing in these days and these weeks. But really that this is just one part of the strategy to work toward maps that we feel confident as staff are meeting the policy goals and the community's desires. And they're productive. It's a list of things because that's a productive way for us to move forward from many different possible solutions to a smaller number of possible solutions, right? So we'll be adding nuance in the coming weeks to our evaluation, and we'll be including community's perspective throughout that process. So that's it. With that caveat, I will pass it to Myung, and we can go to the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. So this is a transition. So we are going to zoom out a bit. So the last meeting was, as Joseph said, about making sure that everyone understands what the new policy is and the ways we're developing the zone boundaries. And this next part of the presentation is to try to help participants internalize how the new enrollment system fits within the broader district context. And commissioners, I paid close attention to your discussion at the last ad hoc committee meeting and thought that was really happening in your discussion last month. So I want to just continue that. So if we can go to the next slide. Great. So this slide shows the theory of action that is described in the board policy for the new zone-based approach, the new zone-based assignment policy. And as you know, a theory of action is a connected set of ideas that explain how change will lead to improved practices and improved outcomes. In other words, if we do certain things, then we expect certain outcomes and a long-term impact. For this new student assignment system, the first column includes things that staff are aiming to do throughout policy implementation. For example, creating zones that are diverse. The second column describes if we successfully implement the actions in the first column, the expected outcomes. For example, student assignment will help create more diverse enrollment. And then the last column describes the long-term impact. For example, each and every student will receive the quality instruction and equitable support required to thrive per our mission statement. So the theory of action can help us understand a couple of things. First, the design and implementation of the new student assignment policy or elementary student assignment policy is connected with the district's mission, and that this change can have a direct and positive impact on the outcomes we see for students and schools. But second, and equally important, is that student assignment can't work in isolation. So you see that some of the text on this slide is highlighted. And the highlights show what student assignment, in our view, can control and directly influence. But the other pieces of text that are not highlighted are also important parts of the theory of action that require other things to happen in coordination with the new student assignment policy. And if all we do is change the details of the student assignment policy, and we don't, as a district, make the necessary shifts to support students and schools in the new context, then we won't achieve the theory of action. They all work together. We can go to the next slide. Okay, here's another new graphic. So this shows that our staff team has been thinking about what it will take to achieve the theory of action. And here you can see some of what those elements are. There's a universe of factors that are needed to create the positive outcomes identified in the board policy. And again, the elementary student assignment policy is one of them. You can see that in the yellow boxes with the star next to it, alongside strategic placement of special day classes and language pathways and the vision for consistent instructional standards in our schools. But there are other parts to this universe, including infrastructure, human capital, and student family supports that all have a necessary role to play in this work. Some of the boxes on this slide, as you can see, represent things that staff are hearing from families. And during our community engagement process in the fall, families highlighted the need for school integration within buildings, meaningful integration within school buildings, and access to equitable resources across schools. And all of these factors are in service of achieving integrated learning environments and high quality experiences in schools. And also want to say that our staff are already coordinating to implement some of these shifts. For example, we have colleagues in transportation and facilities and budget, special education, multilingual pathways, as well as school site leadership that are already collaborators in policy implementation. We've also been coordinating with city partners and CBOs. And after the policy details are finalized this school year, the work to plan and make these shifts in these areas will need to continue in the lead up to the 2024-25 school year and beyond. Next slide, please. So hopefully this part of the presentation helped commissioners and participants internalize the types of things that are necessary in a holistic way to make the policy's theory of action true. And with that, our questions for the board on this topic are, just to restate, number one, what can we do to make the theory of action true? And number two, how can we support the universe of shifts we're describing? We realize these are broad questions. We're, as we said, many of us are engaging with these questions very deeply ourselves. So this is a invitation to share thoughts and reflections. Certainly, we're not looking to commissioners to provide all the answers, but definitely interested in any thoughts you can share with us.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments from commissioners or student delegates? Vice President Lamb?
Commissioner Bogus, are we asking for clarifying or for discussion to answer invitations and reactions to these questions?
Yeah, I think I can clarify. So I think we're still asking for the public to wait to comment until we get to the end of the presentation. And I think we are asking for primarily clarifying questions from this point. But I do think staff is asking us if we do want to answer the questions now to do that as well, or we also have the ability to do that after public comment. So I think there's flexibility depending on how commissioners want to handle that.
If it's okay with you, Chair Bogus, maybe I'll just wait. So then we can have a more robust conversation and not feel like I'm inhibiting maybe any of the process or public comment. That sounds okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that. Marisha, did you have a comment?
Nope, I'm up next.
I have one. I'm sorry. Let me get my clarifying
Go ahead.
question in first. Could we please go back to slide 13? I really appreciate this slide and the kind of clarity this provides and kind of the gaps and kind of our ultimate vision and what is able to kind of be done through the process we're engaging with. I think the question that I have is from a board level. Are you asking us to kind of take action to give direction in kind of official capacity, or is it more we want to use a collaborative conversation space to kind of direct these things forward? Because I think the things that aren't highlighted feel very important to me, and I think I want to know how we as a board should prioritize them, knowing that we're so far kind of in the process already.
That's a great question, Commissioner. Maybe we could all chime in, Joseph and Marisha, if you have thoughts, but I'll just share some thoughts on my part. I think it's sort of twofold. So the theme that we've internalized and continue to think about is that the whole system, our multiple facets of our approach to all of these issues has to change. And so we need to work really hard and conscientiously on the important details of the student assignment policy, which are more in the highlighted sections. And we also have to work with our colleagues, work with school leaders and school communities. We have to work with our partners in multiple types of engagements to really have a holistic view and an understanding of these very broad shifts. And so the board we see as essential in that as well. And like I observed last month, I mean, we see that happening in this committee's discussions. That was incredibly encouraging to see yourselves, the commissioners, to notice and really we can tell that you're internalizing this, and we think that has to be true of the board going forward. The specific question about what form that should take, I think we don't have specific requests at this point. I mean, whether that should be through board actions or anything like that. We think that this committee is really important to create a series of study session spaces, and maybe that should extend to. I know there's been discussion about having conversations with the full board, for example, in a committee of the whole setting or a full board meeting setting. And these are the kinds of themes that we'd like to engage the whole body in. So I personally, I don't have I don't think we have a specific request right here tonight to say, please take these steps to help surface and raise attention to these issues in the Board of Education space per se. But we are thinking about issues like that, and would like to talk with superintendent and our colleagues in multiple roles about that specific question. But tonight it's continuing to raise awareness and deepen the understanding of these interconnections. So I don't know if Joseph or Marisha, if you'd like to add on to anything.
That was well said, Myung. Thank you. I'll just add, I think the purposes for us to include this in this evening's presentation are first to kind of get feedback from the board on if you have any kind of instruction or request for staff as far as kind of how we are working to make this vision come true. So, we've talked about collaboration and partnership with departments that we've already started. Like if there are specific needs that you've identified, we want to make sure that we're hearing those. But then I think, as Myung alluded to, like the second purpose is just kind of finding the right ways to be in open conversation, as you said, Commissioner Bogus, about all of these types of shifts and their relationship to the change in student assignment. I think that's really where it makes sense to us to begin, and then kind of whether there are kind of more formal actions that we would recommend taking would, I guess, come out of those conversations.
Thank you for that. And I also want to recognize Commissioner Sanchez, who joined earlier. And I think we can continue with our presentation unless commissioners have clarifying questions. Seeing none, let us
Hey,
proceed.
Chair Bogus, I was asked to go back to the translation slide briefly at this time.
Thank you, Judson. If we could have the translation information repeated, please, for our guest.
各位家長，如果你需要中文翻譯的話咧，你可以打熒光幕上面嘅 Google Meet 電話號碼係1484-553-3328，密碼係721-609-895井字。Spanish, please go ahead.
Buenas tardes. Si usted desea servicios de interpretación en español para la reunión de esta tarde, por favor marque el siguiente número para conectarse con la plataforma de Google Meet. 1-319-382-9676. Y una vez conectado, por favor, entre el siguiente número de acceso. 665-996-976 y el símbolo numérico. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for that. All right, so I'm Marisha Robinson, the Community Engagement Manager, and I have the honor of engaging all of our stakeholders at the various levels in conversations around designing our zones and implementing the policy. Next slide. So, as Ms. Young described, we're envisioning a range of projects and improvement that the district will need to work towards. In this section, I'll give updates on different conversations I've had with the community, or the team has had with the community, where we are within the community in those conversations, and to surface some important topics that are going to happen in future conversations. One of the ways that we try to stay connected to the community and in conversation and create kind of like a two-way communication strategy with the public is through our bi-weekly email newsletter. And if you're signed up for that, you know that there's an option for you to send us questions and give us input and feedback on all the different items that we're talking about for the new student assignment policy. And I just want to highlight right now this section from the last newsletter that lines up well with the conversation that we were just having about all of the universe shifts that will have to happen and that are required to support the policy theory of action. So how we're going to line up all those moving pieces so that this can be a success. We believe that it'll take everyone in the district, and it's going to take our community as well, working together to achieve our goals. And these are big changes, and it's going to take a whole bunch to make it happen. And we want to make sure that everyone stays connected in the process and can stay involved and support the work that is happening and give input and feedback. And one of those ways is, as I mentioned, by this bi-weekly newsletter. So I invite you all to sign up for our newsletter. You can go to sfusd.edu/student assignment and sign up for our newsletter and see some current updates. Next slide, please. So we are definitely keeping the community involved in other ways as well. We recently had a town hall to summarize all of our findings from fall 2021 community workshops and engagement. There was also another opportunity. This was also an opportunity for the members of the public to ask questions about how the new policy will work. We collected an extensive Q&A form, lots and lots of questions. We're also actively planning engagement opportunities for this spring. We're aiming to create opportunities that are meaningful, accessible, and will work with community partners to do so. So whether that engagement is really big workshops or small intimate meetings, we're working really hard and strategically to reach all of our community. All right. And then finally, our district advisory committee on the student assignment has been created and has been meeting regularly. This is a group of parent leaders from the district who meet regularly to go deeper into the policy implementation work. Next slide, please. We also wanted to take this opportunity right now to surface some of the important conversations that have been brought to our attention and that we're working intentionally to do deeper work around. Some of these are difficult topics and difficult questions that we know are on people's minds, and we need to acknowledge that. We think with the board and acknowledge them and think with the board how we plan to address some of these as a district. And I'm going to take some time here to read what's on our slides about the different topics. So we know that diversity is something that our community wants to know more about and how we're using it to implement in our zones. Diversity for who? Why are we talking about diversity? How are we preserving affinity spaces and avoiding isolation? And how are we aiming for inclusiveness and integration at the school sites? And how are we counteracting our residential segregation that exists in San Francisco? Proximity, right? Schools need to be close to home. Schools need to be close to work for some of us. And proximity really means different things based on whether you're using to describe it with geography, whether you're using it to describe how far your commute is in traffic, or just based on your hectic schedule, right? There's predictability. Whew. So current uncertainty about the future is causing discomfort, right? But we know that one of the goals of this new student assignment policy is to create predictability, at least in the school assignment process. Equity, right? We hear you loud and clear, equity. We're looking at paying careful attention to how this new system will impact specific groups. There's going to be a need to be an all-around investment to reduce disparities, and staffing practices are super important at the school site level. Choice, right? Choice is empowering for families, and families choose based on multiple factors. We hear loud and clear that families fear losing access to preferred schools and not having their preferred school inside of their zone. We hear loud and clear also that families want to talk about quality and quality schools, right? This is something that SFUSD as a whole needs to ensure for our families. Right now, some families consider that some schools are not the schools that would be the right ones for their babies. And district impacts. So what are we doing about language pathways and special education pathways? And families definitely want to know about how the middle school feeder system as well will change, and about school funding and the disparity of resources between school sites and how that will be impacted or changed as well. And then other family impacts. We know families, of course, want to keep siblings together, and they want to understand that the new system better and what exactly that'll mean for their particular child in their particular case. And as I stated before, we're doing intentional work around addressing all of these topics and creating space to have more conversation about them. Next slide, please. So some questions and thoughts to think about. What would you like staff to prioritize? Would you like staff to prioritize any of these specific topics in future ad hoc committee meetings? And I'll leave it open there if anyone has any questions to ask.
Any commissioners or student delegates with questions or comments for clarification at this point? Oh, I would just lift up the importance of the conversation around quality schools and having people really define like what that means and what that doesn't mean. So I think that'll be a really big thing for us kind of at the end of the day. Okay, let us continue with our presentation.
I think Commissioner Lamb's hand is up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to chime in really quick. Absolutely on the quality discussions of quality schools, and which we've heard since early on in the process over the last couple of years is around the district impacts. So around language pathways, special education pathways, because we had talked about how important it is to have equity within the zone. So just wanted to name that as well.
Thank you. I'll now pass it off back to Joseph.
Thanks, Marisha. Okay, well, thank you for those initial responses, Commissioners Bogus and Lamb, and we look forward to kind of hearing any more thoughts or questions about some of those big topics that Marisha spoke through. I am going to go ahead and pick up one of those big topics. One of the things listed on the previous slide with all those little rectangles that Marisha spoke through was choice. And we want to spend a bit more time right now kind of starting to unpack that. Our biweekly newsletter that Marisha alluded to will actually be discussing the same topic of choice and what it means for a new policy to constrain choice in the next edition. And we know that choice is really important to families, and that constraining choice is a critical component of how our new policy will work. So we want to just take this time to put a spotlight on this conversation and be able to like receive and maybe sit with together how we're kind of considering and addressing this topic. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so here you can see quotes from people who have participated in community engagement sessions throughout our policy development and implementation phases. So on the left, you can see quotes from spring of 2020, and on the right, you can see quotes from our more recent fall 2021 engagement. So I'm just going to read the top one from each, and then I'll read the summary below. So in spring 2020, one person said, we need to ensure that families have the ability and option to find a program or school or option that meets the unique needs of the student. And then more recently, we heard more options equals more opportunities. And I'll also like acknowledge in the gray boxes on the bottom of this slide, the reports that staff produced after these community engagement sessions both included big takeaways related to choice. So first, from spring of 2020, staff reported that families recognize that choice can be inequitable and can harm schools that are perceived as being less desirable. At the same time, many families want to be able to choose a school that works for them. I think that's a good summary. And then from the more recent report, two of our takeaways were that most families prioritize choice over proximity, but they value both. And families want to ensure access to a range of language and special education programs for their child. So I'm just going to let us sit here for 30 seconds to give people a chance to read through some of these quotes. Okay, and I'll say, you know, we just want to be able to have this conversation around this big topic of choice and constraining choice as part of our ad hoc discussion this evening. And we wanted to start with some of the voices of family members and participants in community engagement. And we can move to the next slide, where we attempt to kind of summarize what we know about the role of choice in student assignment. So some of this is repetitive, but again, just want to kind of lay out some things that we think are true. Families value having options. Choice can be a form of empowerment. Families make choices about their students' school for many different reasons. So each individual family kind of has different drivers impacting which schools they apply to and which schools they really prioritize. Access to choice is not equitably distributed. Many families face systemic barriers to information, transportation, and other factors that are necessary in order for district-wide choice to be beneficial. There's a trade-off between more choices and more predictability. Individual choices preserve segregation and can result in kind of extra segregation beyond what we would just see based on neighborhood characteristics. And just a district study from a few years ago kind of surfaced this insight. And then finally, under our current system of unconstrained choice, the district is facing outcomes that aren't desirable or acceptable at the system level and for individual families in some cases. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So that was what we know, or at least what I propose we know about the role of choice. Now we just want to surface what it means for us to constrain choice. So our new policy is constraining choice in two ways. The first is zones. So we're constraining which schools each applicant has access to. So which schools families can apply for. But the second way that we haven't talked in much detail about is diversity categories, which are a way for us to promote diversity at the school level when it comes to students actually enrolling within their zone. So diversity categories mean that we're combining families' choices with the district priority of diversity. Okay, so both of those things impact how students are assigned to the schools. Now, what this means for families practically, there will be fewer options. So families will be able to choose from a subset of SFUSD elementary schools. And the list of possible options for each applicant will be smaller than it is today, right? Second, there are geographic boundaries. So when we're kind of creating zones, we end up with boundaries that give access to schools for students within their zone, but students won't be able to cross zone boundaries to attend school. And that means families might live near a zone boundary that makes them unable to apply to some schools that are relatively close by because they're on the other side of the boundary. And then third, we're balancing choice and diversity. So families express their preferences through choice. And then as a district, we're balancing those with the goal of diversity. And the diversity category of each applicant, which again is determined by the characteristics of where they live, can have an impact on which school they ultimately get assigned to. And I see Commissioner Lopez's hand up. The next slide was a prompt that concludes this section. So I'm happy to stop here, or we can show that prompt and then.
Let's stop here. President Lopez, go, please.
Just a quick clarifying question. When you're talking about choice, you mean a family's ability to choose any school across the district. We're not talking about choice within zones.
I detach it. The idea of choice, let's detach it from like any specific policy. We're talking about choice as kind of like a value, something that families value. And then the last slide gets us to kind of a recognition of like how the extent to which people value choice, how that intersects with the policy change we're making in the introduction of zones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Vice President Lamb, did you have any questions or comments?
Sorry, no, my hand was still up, but I have lots of comments after public comment.
Let's continue with the presentation if we have nothing else from commissioners and student delegates.
Sure, thank you. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the end of our presentation, and I'll just wrap up by helping us look ahead. And we can move to the next slide where you'll see a timeline. A similar version of this timeline we've shared before. We're slowly inching this star that shows where we are currently farther along to the right. So now we're, in the spring. Our goal for this year, and really our work for this year, is to develop the zones, diversity categories, and tiebreakers for the new assignment policy. And we're aiming to be able to complete that work in June of this academic year. At the same time, we're beginning and continuing in some cases the work on these other kind of partnerships and things that we think will be really important for us to be able to have the impact we want to have as a team and a district. And so that alludes back to some sections from today's presentation around the universe of shifts. So we're starting to kind of work toward those shifts, and that work will continue over the next 2 years and then beyond that. And a reminder for everyone, this policy change we're making will impact students enrolling, elementary school students enrolling in 2024-25. And that year it will just impact the incoming class. So this new policy change will be kind of rolled out year by year, starting in 2024. So we can go to the next slide. And I think the good news for us, thank you. Good news for us is that we have some ad hoc committees on the calendar. So we already have some future conversations scheduled, and we're looking forward to continuing these sessions. Our upcoming meetings are listed here. April 13th is the next one. And we have various topics that we think will be important for us to cover in these 3 meetings. And I know some of our questions that we sprinkled throughout today's presentation are also about hearing from the commissioners what you want to make sure staff are bringing to these upcoming conversations. And I think there's one more slide, so you can move forward. Here's a restatement of the 4 questions we asked throughout the presentation. And these are things that we would love to hear feedback on. And so I'll just read them out loud to conclude the presentation. So what changes or additions do you suggest to our working definitions for evaluating zones? What can staff and what can the board do to make the theory of action that we described true? And how can we support the universe of shifts? Would you like staff to prioritize any of the specific conversation topics that Marisha surfaced in future ad hoc committee meetings? And what more information can we bring to continued conversations about the role of choice in student assignment? And that's it. Thanks for your participation and engagement throughout.
Thank you so much to staff for presenting. I think unless commissioners or student delegates have anything urgent, why don't we go to public comment? And I think we can give 2 minutes per commenter. And then after we have public comment, we will have discussion on the board. I think what I'll do, just to kind of give just kind of a little forecast, is I think I'll just ask each of the 4 questions that are on that last slide, and then we'll kind of give folks the opportunity on the board, the commissioners and student delegates, to respond and just kind of share their thoughts, as well as to raise any additional questions that you might have. And so I think with that, why don't we go to public comment?
Thank you, Commissioner Bogus. What total time would you like for public comment?
Let's give them 12 hours. Let's see if they can.
All right, 12 hours.
I don't know if we have that many hands up, but I mean, I think let's start right now with 20 minutes, and we can come back and assess after that.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yes, please raise your hand if you care to speak to the presentation this evening. And can that be repeated in Chinese and Spanish?
如果你想就住今晚嘅會議咧講公眾發言的話咧，而家可以舉手啦，每人有2分鐘嘅時間嘅，唔該。
Por favor, levante la mano si quiere hacer un comentario público con respecto a la presentación de hoy día. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Josephine?
Yes, hi, Commissioner and staff. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think that the universal mind shift and all that is so necessary. I just wanted to make sure, I think this is going to be great if we can get it implemented. I just want to make sure that some of the practicality is still being keep in mind. So I'm thinking about, the Title I schools that are usually have high low-income students as well as colliding, like coinciding with English learners and language pathway. So if we need to do something about it because of a certain concentration of groups or something. So what is the impact, which makes sense sometimes, but then it will impact the Title I funding, right? So what is the practicality of that? So, and I'm also thinking about the Southeast area where the most needed help is over there, like Bayview, Hunters Point, this valley, Portola. So 4 out of the 9 bottom 5 schools rated in 2019 is in that area. So when we have that zone, what are the combination and how is that going to be received, and how are we going to make sure that there's language pathway, special ed, and K-8 schools in that zone that are quality education? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Tony.
Hello, thank you for this presentation. I'm sorry I joined a little late, so I don't know if you already mentioned this. Is there a plan for families who may traditionally apply for schools late, as far as them having some sort of choice? Like when I first moved here, I would go the first day of school and take my kids to the school in my neighborhood. That was in the 90s. So is there a plan for people who don't traditionally go through the first round? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Kira.
Hi, thanks for doing all this work. I graduated from SWSD, so I was in elementary school when it was all based on where you live. So I'm glad that we're going a little bit towards that to make it more predictable and keep the community feel of like the community of where kids live, so they can commute together and so on. There's a few considerations I hope that the group is taking into account. One is not just proximity by miles, but proximity in relation to, is there a muni route that goes there? Because not everyone has a car, and not everyone is able to bike with children. Since we're talking about elementary school kids, they can't go by themselves, right? I hope that the after school programs and the other kind of enrichment programs that some schools have, they're not, at this point, equitable or equal or the same offerings across our schools. And so there are programs that are only available in a few schools that are very desirable for parents, but it's just impossible because there's very few families across the district. They may want these programs. And so if those kids are now dispersed across more schools, those community organizations wouldn't be able to provide the programs anymore because there wouldn't be enough demand in any one location. And finally, I really hope that this group is working with the district to reevaluate the start times for elementary schools, because so many of them have been moved to 7:50 in the morning, which is really, really tough and has been negatively impacting my child every single day, and as well as therefore our entire family. And I hope that's really reconsidered, especially if we're limiting how many schools an individual child can apply to. We need to have a lot more diversity with the hours that the school starts. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, KH, it says.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I want to echo the previous caller and thank you for all the work that the board and the staff has done on this topic. But I do have a lot of concerns about kind of that issue of proximity being miles versus kind of commuting distance. And that just in general, I know that you have, talked about these zones, but I feel like there's still that amorphous blob idea that, you kind of have on that picture. And that I think a lot of people in their heads kind of have it like a bicycle where they're in the middle and then the spokes are out. So they're kind of thinking like, oh, it's the 3 closest schools to me and maybe 2 that are a little farther. But I think that, obviously due to the diversity that you want to bring to these zones, your zones are going to look a lot different and to have the greatest impact. And so I think that, you're going to have to spend some time really talking about the zones when they come and kind of explain more of the upside and how they really benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Tiff.
Hi, I have 2 questions, and I've emailed SFUSD, and I also am aware that these answers might not yet be there, but it would be good to just know. One is, when will we see the possible zones? And 2, if we have a child that is already in SFUSD, will they be able to move into their zones once the zones are available? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Forgive me if I mispronounce Aileen or Aline.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the thoughtful analysis. Was wondering if there is an estimate on how the implementation of this proposal might impact enrollment. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorianda.
Good evening, everybody. This is Rihanna Vickeys, and I would like to echo the sentiments of one of the previous callers regarding making sure that there's equitable access, because as we all know, different schools sites across the city have very different PTA funding, right? And so that definitely impacts the programs and the maybe even nurses or positions that the schools are able to offer, because their PTAs are able to fund those different sources independently of what the school district has to offer. So when the zones are being created, I ask that we be mindful of all those different variables to make sure that our babies have access to the highest quality schools available with the most enriching programs. While I do understand that proximity is very important, we also want to make sure that our babies have access to the education that they desire with the resources that they desire as well, because we don't want more children leaving, to charter schools, which we all know are heavily invading our schools right now, right? So we want to do all that we can to make sure that SFUSD is standing out and is going to be the top choice. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe it's Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Judson. This is Michelle Jacques-Menegas with the Parent Advisory Council to the board. And I too want to appreciate all the work that's gone into this process so far. It's very clear from your presentation that you have taken the community engagement and you've applied it to what you've been doing, and I really appreciate that. There's just 2 things I want to highlight. One, and I think this was brought up before, just really want to make sure that the district is partnering with and getting input from the community organizations that provide out of school time programs and other enrichments, like you've heard some of the parents or callers talk about this evening. I also really want to lift up this issue that has come up numerous times about families being able to choose a school that is actually close to where they work, which may not be the same thing as close to where they live. And this is really, really, really important to many of the parents that I've heard from, including some PAC members, and just really want to make sure that that piece is taken into consideration. I know it throws a wrench in the works and it makes things complicated, but
it's vital for some folks to be able to be close to have their kids close to where they work so they can get there in an emergency, they can drop off, pick up, these kinds of things. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Forgive me if I mispronounced Nair Bodad.
Yes, hi. This is Vinod. Thank you for taking the time to actually work with the community to arrive at this proposal. I didn't hear this explicitly discussed today, but I have a grave concern about changing the start times. Both my kids go to a K through 8 program, which starts at 7:50 today, and it's now going to get shifted to 9:30. It's a significant disruption. So I wanted to know from this group on how community input was sought before that change was made, especially given the preschool or pre-start childcare that's needed for parents who have early starts to their jobs, and the impact of existing after-school programs, given that the new school hours would significantly reduce the after-school care hours that they could give. So just want to know what kind of community involvement was sought for that, and I would really appreciate if that is opened up for some more community input.
Thank you. And that concludes public comment.
All right, thank you so much to all the public commenters. Why don't we start with any clarifying questions, comments, thoughts from any commissioners or student delegates? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. I can call on you, and then we can go into the questions that we have. Vice President Lamb.
And perhaps this is also part of the discussion, but I think for staff, it'd be particularly important to get recommendations from you all of kind of quote working backwards around some key milestones and decision-making timetables. So although, we've had the kind of fixed Gantt chart of the timeline, I think even asking further, are there decision points? And I think that's important to the public. I think it's also important around how we plan as a board, around, what makes sense around a committee as a whole, in addition to the 3 committee meetings of dates we've already set for this ad hoc committee. Essentially, I don't want to get too far ahead where it's like, quote, a point of no return. We've done the analysis. Now we're kind of waiting for a decision, and then the public or our colleagues feel like, quote, surprised.
President Lamb, was that a question for us to respond to, or more of a
It's
comment?
more consideration as future, since that was a question, I think, about, what would be helpful for the future. I think it'd be more about, because right now, I think, while helpful in that timeline chart, I think starting to get a little bit tactical, working, if there are going to be some key decision dates for the board or for the public, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Vice President Lamb. I think I'll jump in and then we'll kind of move forward. I think one message I would have, from my perspective, is that as we kind of go down this journey and move to this zone model, I think we're going to have to change the way that we think about our schools and the independence that each school site has. Our schools are going to have to become more similar to each other. I mean, what they offer to kind of create more parity across the zones in the schools, or we're going to have to figure out a different way to provide access to our high demand programs, so that regardless of the school that you go to, you still have access to the programs that you desire. So I think just being really clear about kind of how this is shifting the way that we kind of think about our schools and kind of go about that work, just with a real kind of clear eye that this is a very big shift in a lot of ways, and that we're going to have to do a lot of shifting to kind of make this work and to make it be successful for everybody. Okay, I think with that, why don't we go back to the questions, which are on slide 29. We can pull that up if commissioners request, but if not, we'll maybe just keep it down so we can see each other better. But the first question is, what changes or additions do you suggest to staff workings definitions or zone evaluations? If anyone wants to respond to that specifically. Please, President Lopez.
Thank you. And I also just want to make sure if our student delegates want to jump in, I don't want to get ahead of them. But regarding the working definitions, I had a question around number 3 under proximity, which reads, the map preserves more than X% of home to school walking networks. And I think what I'd like for us to expand on is the definition of walking networks. And I guess I'm just wondering, is this creating a communication amongst different schools in the zone that parents and students will get to walk with other groups of parents and students? I think I need to have a better idea of what a walking network is and how we're providing that. And then I have just a larger question about transportation.
Would it be appropriate for me to respond?
Yes, please.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So walking networks, I appreciate the question, and apologies that kind of presentation makes it ambiguous what that really means. So I don't have the specific kind of measures that were used to get us to that definition. But what walking networks are attempting to do is identify areas around schools that make residents in that area able to access the school as a pedestrian. And it's a combination that considers the geographic distance from school and proximity to slow streets. And I guess proximity, like inclusion of slow streets. So I think it was kind of X distance on a slow street or some kind of shorter distance on a street that's not closed for pedestrian use. And so we were able to, our research partners at Stanford were able to calculate that and generate a map that kind of places each school at the center of its own little island. And then you can see an area around the school that tells us, like, this area, if students live in this area, they can probably access that school as pedestrians. And then the measure we're looking at is, once we introduce zone boundaries, how many of those walking pathways from home to school are we still preserving? Is that clear?
So you have the number of walking boundaries, walking networks, and then when we create the zones, you'll have the number within that zone. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, well, maybe think about it like at the map level. We could think about a map of San Francisco, and we could shade in the areas that put a house within walking distance of a school. And like we would see that around every school, right? But then when we introduce zone boundaries, some of those areas would be disrupted, right? Because if there's a boundary between you and your school, you're not actually able to walk there and start your school day. That's not like a walking pathway that's accessible based on the zone boundaries. So what we're aiming to do with that measure is make sure that we're picking maps that are doing as little of that disruption as possible. We want as many families as possible to be able to access the schools that are close to them and within walking distance of them. And then last thing I'll say, it doesn't have anything to do with kind of like coordinated, like walking school bus programs or kind of like coordinated specific walking networks. And instead was just trying to quantify like how much close school enrollment we'd be able to preserve.
Okay. So I want to expand just a little bit and say, I hope that the next step is to coordinate with conversations that are already happening around that, especially with our community groups. I know the public has mentioned that various times, but I just wonder how within the understanding of what a pathway for a pedestrian to get from home to school is, and recognizing some of the areas within San Francisco that students don't feel safe walking through. And I wonder if that's part of this number. So again, I know that it's just like a general pathway across the city, and you're getting that number based off of what researchers are finding, but I do hope that within this definition that is included, and that obviously will need to involve our community partners.
Can I just chime in really quickly? As Joseph explained, the approach that we're using, I wanted to also agree with you, President Lopez, that definitely the conversations within the community will, once we get to the point of seeing our actual, or seeing draft zones and boundaries and discussing that, we'll have conversations about what it will take within the whole system, including the city, county, and school district, to make it safe for our families and students to be able to walk to those schools that are close to them, and creating proximity, and that those things are moving together on a parallel path and not separate. And so at times we may not always in our presentations share those things and highlight those important things, but I do want to assure the community and the public and the commissioners as well that those conversations are happening at the same time, right? If this affects the school district, how does it affect the educational partner, which is the community and families as well?
Can I, Commissioner Bogus, can I just hop in on this one?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen over the years that so many of our families, even if they live 3 blocks away from school, get a ride to school from their parents. When I was principal at Cleveland, the vast majority of our families, of the close to 400 students that went to that school when I was there, lived within maybe a half-mile radius of the school, but yet the vast majority of kids were picked up or dropped off at school. So I wonder if we can do some analysis about what's happening in reality in terms of actually our families walking to school. I know we have like safe routes to schools. We have a lot of programs that encourage that, but I don't think it's really happening across the board. I'd like to know what's really happening in terms of families really taking advantage of walking to school, even if they live like really close. And it's frankly, in the school I teach at right now in Daly City, folks live within 3 or 4 blocks from that school and they drive their kids to school. It's just I think it's one of the realities that we're having to deal with right now, is that people fear for their kids' safety, so they drive them to school. So maybe we can do some analysis around that as well.
Commissioners, could we ask Jessica Kuo to comment on this?
Please.
So I represent the Transportation Department of SFUSD as its Principal Transportation Planner, and I have been working very closely with SFMTA, who oversees the streets, to ensure that the zones make sense from a transportation perspective. I myself am someone who lives in the city and doesn't own a car. I rely on Muni, my own 2 feet, and biking. And so do, many of the parents that I, work with as well. And even when they're in areas of the city that don't have as much infrastructure, this is a means of bringing better infrastructure improvements to those neighborhoods. And so it's definitely in my interest to ensure that people feel safe if they don't have access to a car. And, my commitment to the student assignment process is that we're not making sure we're not leaving out transportation as an afterthought. We want to make sure that everyone who can travel around by all modes are served. And so for sure, we're going to make sure that transportation is at the forefront.
Student Delegate Lamb.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Ms. Quo for that. I wanted to add on to Commissioner Sanchez's point. I think a lot of students, although maybe they can walk to school, the reason why they're getting picked up and dropped off is because they're along the way for their parents' commute. So like what happens is they get in the car and they drop the kids off, even if they're a couple blocks away, and then they head off to work. And I think that's where the car situation comes from. I think to some degree, some parents do carpools because they don't feel safe walking to school, but I also think there is a degree of the commute aspect. And so I'm wondering how we're taking that into account. And also, I think someone in public comment brought up like parents' workplaces, if that's even an option to consider. I know that it might get a little tricky with the zones, but if we're able to even consider where parents work and the whole commute situation. Sorry, I don't know if that was clear.
We're definitely looking into that. We have a school access plan going on with the SFCTA, and I'm in close coordination with the SFMTA, whose jurisdiction is the streets. And so we're all definitely bringing in all the relevant partners to ensure that, you know, all these concerns are being met.
Thank you for that. I would just also, I think we as a board are gonna have to figure out how we kind of promote and kind of encourage folks to walk more and coordinate more ways to kind of support bringing folks into school sites without kind of using cars, just because it makes such a much more complicated experience at our school sites, even though I love my car. If we could get an answer from staff in regards to being able to select schools near work sites. I know when that's come up in the past, the answer typically is that we're actually kind of setting this up based off where people live, which would kind of limit their ability to do anything outside of it. But just if staff could also just kind of respond and give more clarity and maybe even a fuller explanation of kind of why we're kind of preserving that or not.
So Commissioner, I'll say, I'll share my understanding that the board policy that was passed in December of 2020 refers to using the approach that we've been focusing on related to proximity to residences. So we can certainly look, I don't know if any staff colleagues want to comment further, but I guess for tonight, I would suggest that we revisit that. We could reconfirm that is indeed the case, and clarify the parameters that we are working within with respect to the board policy.
Thank you so much for that. And if it isn't burdensome, it would be really interesting if, you know, families who were interested in that option could reach out to us and let us know in some way to get a feel of how much interest there really is for that. Because I definitely know for some people it's vital, but trying to get an idea of what percentage of families that is, I think also can impact our ability to kind of make a policy. If it's like 3 people, it makes it easier to do something special. Vice President Lamb, did you have an additional question or comment?
Yeah, I think related to the definitions, you know, we've talked about this since the very beginning around the proximity. And, you know, I appreciate the kind of the next level of detail about how we're going to measure that as far as X amount, you know, schools and the mile radius from the house. I think I would like us to be more explicit or to add a subset around clarity, or be specific that it would also include public transportation. And certainly while the routes change and MTA as it's going through its own budgetary, you know, challenges, I just really think we need to name that, because that way families and the public can see that and know that from the very beginning, and this committee has said it from day one, how important that is. Because what we don't want to do is put forward a plan that might be, you know, related to X amount of miles, or, you know, and And then we're realizing in the 10th hour, like, oh, Muni's actually in the next 2 years going to cut service to that. And how's that going to impact? Or the fact that it takes two transfers, and that's really going to take an hour and a half, but by car, technically it would take 15 minutes. So I just really want us to be forthright about that and working. And Jessica, I know you've been, hand in hand, discussing with MTA, but I would like to see it even more visible moving forward. And that'd be really helpful, because I think there is a lot of fluctuation with MTA, and I just want to make sure we're like, at the table together.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Vice President Lamb. I think what we can do now is go to the next question, which is, what can staff and the board do to make the theory of action true? How can we support the universe of shifts we envision? I can respond first. I think, actually, can I have President Lopez go first if you're ready?
I didn't want to cut you off. I can go whenever.
Okay, yeah, I'll go really quick. Thank you so much. I would just say in regards to this question that I think the board needs to figure out how to make sure that the zone process makes things better for everyone. I feel like a lot of the things highlighted on slide 13 in regards to a theory of action that I think are most like substantial and meaningful or are not yet addressed. Which I think creates a lot of opportunity for us to work with the broader community and the city to really create solutions to ensure that we get the best outcome possible. And so I think that's the only thing that I would add, and I will make way for President Lopez.
Thank you. What I would add is, of course, the ability for this to be successful is everyone's involvement. And I've seen how hard you all have been working. I've seen, Marisha, you've been connecting with all of us to get more insight with the communities we work with and the groups that are actively participating in our district to get the information out. So I see a lot of that work being done. And I think there was a question in one of the slides that you shared that I had, which was around the district advisory committee. I'm just wondering who is a part of that group, or what is the formation of that, and who is involved, to get a better idea.
So the District Advisory Committee on the Student Assignment Policy is a committee that exists to support the part of the policy as it was written, that advisory councils would be a part of designing, refining, and suggesting and recommending zones to the superintendent and the Board of Education. And so it consists of parent leaders from our different district represented advisory councils, along with a couple of parent leaders from our CBOs, from our focal families. There's a wide range of representation. We have representation from our LGBTQ community, representation from our African-American community, our Latinx community, our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, our Chinese community, our monolingual Chinese community as well. And so I might be missing something. Sorry, I don't have the whole list. I know them by name. I don't know them by community. Even. And so there was an intentional focus to ensure that there was representation across the board, socioeconomic status as well, right? All up and down, so that we as a team can work together to really dig into the policy itself and how family and community need to be heard and seen through the policy and the implementation phase. So this committee is actually digging through all of the things that some of the other committees are doing on the internal side and helping us, giving us insight really on what needs to happen for this policy to be successful for families, and not just at the surface level, but really like going inside deep and saying, hey, if you draw this zone here, or you draw this line here, it's not going to work for me and the people who matter to me. So what are you guys going to do about that? And they are charged with pushing back against me with all of their might to ensure that what we're creating as recommendations is indeed a community voice.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Vice President Lamb.
And thank you, following up on President Lopez's question, and thank you, Maurice, for sharing about who makes up the composition of the district, parent and community committee. One question, or maybe more of a statement, and feel free to chime in too about how the process is going, is that it's really important to me that, there's also geographic representation. Certainly, that I don't find conversations between, West Side, East Side, Southeast versus North Side is helpful. We are one district. We have to look at this citywide, and it is really important that, and I voice this also to my colleagues as well, certainly that, I don't want to speak for others, but that how important it is that as we go through this process, because it is such a huge paradigm shift, that the voices of our families and students citywide are being heard.
Yeah, thank you. Oh shucks, thank you, Vice President Lamb, sorry for bringing that up and calling that out. I actually, I have an idea of where our parent reps live, but I don't know for sure to confirm that representation exists. What I can say though also is that now until the implementation of the actual policy, we're doing really small focus groups, and those focus groups are representation across the city, right? They are intentional in reaching out to organizations and groups that are represented by neighborhood. And we use that as a strategic plan as well when developing our spring workshops, when the community will actually have a chance to look at some draft zones.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't we go to the next question?
I'm sorry, Chair Bogus, I did have some comments and
please
thoughts
continue.
there
Sorry.
around the theory of action. And certainly I think Chief O'Keefe has trained me to enough to recognize that our student assignment policy in the zones is not going to address the things that we know is core to what our mission is in the district around when we talk about equity and quality, right, of schools and programs and services and interventions, everything that is on slide 14 around those high quality experiences in all schools. So something I did want to just raise around the intersections of planning are a couple of things that come to mind. One is really ultimately looking at our portfolio of schools. And that has been, in the forefront of our discussions as we're doing budget planning, budget projections between 3 to 5 years, and would love to kind of continue as it may not just be solely here in the ad hoc of student assignment, but really the overlaying, right, of how do we look at the intersections between budget planning over the next 3 to 5 years, the portfolio of schools, and then we've also talked so much about the actual facilities and what it's going to take in order to have the healthiest and learning environments. We made some big adjustments in our bond measures, right, to be able to do a deeper dive around the portfolios of the Southeast schools, about additional outstanding just upkeep of our facilities. So just wanted to name that as, how do we get to our theory of action? Well, part of it is the realities of what our budgets look like. And I know that, hopefully we'll have some better news in the spring with, and also through the state of California, it is also acknowledging how unpredictable it can be. But I just really think that is also core of this. We can't do this work in isolation outside of our budget and outside of also what our projections are around student enrollment.
Thank you so much for that. If there's no comment from staff, why don't we go to the next question, which is, would you like staff to prioritize any of these specific conversation topics in future ad hoc committee meetings? And I believe that is referencing slide 19, I apologize. I've already shared mine as far as quality schools. I don't know if other commissioners or student delegates want to offer up anything.
Commissioner Bogus, I think slide 19 as well as slide 28, I believe. Team, we're interested in both of those sets of topics.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And so highlighting slide 28, which has the topics for the upcoming meetings, is access to language pathways, special day classes in K-8 schools, B, middle school feeders, C, diversity categories and tiebreakers, D, planning spring 2022 community events, and E, draft zones. Commissioner Sanchez.
Thank you, Commissioner Bogus. I have a question around the zones including or not including K-8s and language programs. So originally the conversation was around having every zone having access, even if the school itself, like a K-8, wasn't actually physically in that zone. Students, families would have access to that option. Is that still on the table?
Yes, I'll begin with a response. We know that our policy will need to ensure that families have access to language programs and special day classways. We are currently in the process of developing what that looks like in collaboration with Multilingual Pathway Department and the Special Education Department in SFUSD. And our intent is to be able to describe that approach to the community at the same time that we're sharing the map that shows general education pathway zones, yes. And then to, I guess, explicitly address the question of K-8 schools, we've been having a lot of discussions with staff about the right way to approach that. And some of it is about how many zones we end up with for our general education pathways. And if, depending on where that number lands, then it might be kind of feasible and work really well to have one K-8 school in every zone. If that's not the case, then we need to consider whether we need an alternate method, alternate zones for K-8 access, or that not every zone would give students access to K-8 zones. And we're still developing our answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. And concerning the middle school feeders, that as they exist now, what's the probability of them changing?
I don't have enough of a sense to give an answer to that question.
Okay. I'm just concerned. I mean, I think one of the better policy decisions that's been made in the last 10 years has been having the middle school feeder program that we have. I think it's provided a lot of predictability for our families and by and large has been successful. So I just want us to be mindful of how that program will be affected by this new policy.
Yeah, thank you for that input.
Okay, thank you.
Vice President Lamb, did you have a comment?
plus one what Commissioner Sanchez said as a parent. Certainly the middle school theater was so key. And also hearing from other families over the years. I just wanted to also be explicit if I was a little bit too lofty in my remarks about the budget projections and quality schools and programming. I do think, just kind of learning about both as being a parent, but also serving on the board over the years. And I don't think this is ever an intention of a district, either by staff or board members as we move forward, just to really name that, how do we continue to be human-centered in this? While I think we're very technical, we're going to be looking at simulations, we're going to be looking at the numbers, like X amount of students and X amount of buildings. I just want to name that. And I think maybe then for a future discussion is also to be really explicit about that student and family support, because that's what we've been hearing from families, right? The before and after school programs. What does the student-centered learning climate look like? Essentially, again, it's like, what does that portfolio of school, of programs and services at that school site? While we can't get there in the next year and a half to get all schools to have everything, that I think we have to be really explicit and real with our families about, those intentions and to be able to really see, that we saw when we rolled out with the bell schedule, right? And how we had to also really shore up our CBOs so that they could offer those programmings. I just want us to, quote, front load that so that it is, again, really that human-centered, family-centered, child-centered approach.
If I may, this is Carissa Yee Finley, Director of School Portfolio Planning. So when your earlier comment about school portfolios, definitely applauding that inside. But I do think that the shift towards a zone-based system is going to give us a framework to better organize ourselves as a district, to be strategic about how we support schools, programs, make sure we're more equitably distributing resources, and we'll have that framework to organize around and have conversations around. So I look forward to partnering with the board and once those zones have been shared and established, I think a lot of the work around thinking about, how do we ensure consistent quality experiences that families want and need, that we're providing that across the district. We are engaged in a research partnership right now with researchers from UC Davis and UC Irvine. And so they are actually surveying some families that are submitting school applications this school year, or for this round for the next school year. And so once that research has been collected and analyzed, that might be a good topic for a future committee meeting, both to really understand what families want out of the school portfolio, what they think about, quality experiences and programs that they want and need, and also to make this, ensure that this conversation is really human-centered, as you mentioned, Vice President Lamb.
Thank you so much, Carissa. And one addition to, I think part of that framework is going to be really important for us to own. That is, it is going to be a district centralized kind of approach. We've, certainly are a very decentralized, site-based, empowering district, while, is important. But during significant paradigm shifts like this and policy shifts, like it has to be like, a clear policy at the district level and how we're going to really be able to think about it systemically.
Yeah, thank you for naming that.
All right. I think I had a question, I guess maybe a request even. I guess I'm really interested in the timeline for the conversation about draft zones. Is that something that we're able to do at our April 13th meeting? And when is the soonest we would be able to provide a sample draft map for the public to get angry about and then share their feedback?
I think the soonest opportunity for our public and families to give their input on a draft zone would be when we plan to start our spring engagement, which is estimated to be in May. So early May is when those conversations will begin to happen. That's the anticipated time that we're projecting and scheduling for.
Okay, so then that would mean that at the May 11th meeting that we kind of have projected to be scheduled would be the first time we'd have them available at this meeting space. Does that feel right for staff is when we'd have that conversation?
I would say that that does feel right to me. Of course, with the understanding that that's dependent on exactly how the work goes over the next 2 months, and we'll be certain to kind of share updates and share our projected thinking at the next ad hoc committee meeting. And I'll just add that although we know everyone wants to see maps, and that just makes it so much more concrete and so much more understandable and so much more human for people to be able to kind of identify the impact on themselves. We don't want to kind of focus attention, conversation on things that we don't feel confident in or good about. And that's really why we're trying to invest as much time and energy right now to get to the right maps before we start focusing attention on specific sets of zone boundaries. So that's the approach that we as staff are taking right now.
Yeah, just if I could just add on, from what I've observed, we're putting a lot of thought and getting early staff feedback into the evaluation criteria and the metrics to make sure we're really confident about those before. I know once people see certain boundaries and lines, kind of minds get really set into that. And so before those are previewed, we want to really make sure the metrics behind that are vetted in order to show maps that are viable before the public sees them.
No, I really appreciate that clarity and that call for patience for seeing maps, because I really want to see a bunch of maps. I think one thing I am curious about is what role is like legal counsel or legal advisors playing in the maps that are going to eventually be shown and drawn to ensure that we're not violating any kind of like civil rights or anything with kind of the makeup or kind of the access to programs that we're kind of presenting in the maps.
Commissioner, thank you for your question. I myself am pretty involved with the technical working group and staff, and just taking time to check in on where we're at in the development of the zones, as well as the use of the diversity categories, so that we can stay in line with the law, as well as our board policy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you for being responsible for that. I guess additionally, when we see the zones in May, I would love to be able to look at the zones and to have information about how projected kind of enrollment and attendance for the schools will affect funding, and if both the weighted student formula that we have, the state's weighted student formula, Title I funding, and other kind of funding that kind of comes based off student demographics, as well as if we have any information kind of based off current spending levels and staffing levels of the school, so we can just kind of compare what the zones would look like if we overlaid them on our current school sites. One additional, so I guess that's a request. One additional question I have is, knowing that we have a new school coming in line, is that being taken into account with the zones? And if there are any additional schools after that, how would that kind of be incorporated into our zone process?
I can speak to the new school. So that the current active school project would be in the one in Mission Bay. And so when we talked about, or when we shared school kind of school sites and school data with our partners at Stanford. We did ask them to include Mission Bay as one of the future school sites. And right now, the earliest it would come online as a facility would be 2025. That's what we're working towards. So the student assignment would be implemented in 2024. So of course, any system that creates a zone around that needs to be aware of those slightly different timelines. And I think that while we don't want to have a system where we're updating different zones in different schools every year, our intention is that moving forward, this will be dynamic and be responsive to changing demographics in the city. And so both for new school reasons and for, if there are other shifts in the population where students are living, we would want to be able to incorporate that. As of now, Mission Bay, though, is the only active new school that's being planned right now.
Okay, thank you for that. In regards to the zones as well, even though this is a little bit different from how we structure our school district, I would love to see some zone models based on supervisor districts. If that's not kind of like the set for the boundaries, but just kind of how schools are organized by supervisor districts, just as a potential way to help encourage supervisors to want to fund schools more. Are there any other comments or questions from student delegates or commissioners on this question and related to specific conversations to prioritize for future meetings? I feel like this came up, but I think highlighting the importance of transportation being part of some of these conversations, especially around the zone models. President Lopez?
Adding on to that, and then just conversations around how this can impact enrollment, I think both positively and negatively. And if we are discussing it, how are we highlighting it in a way that's attracting families to take a look at our new assignment system and want to be a part of SFUSD? So I think just more conversations around enrollment.
Thank you so much for that, President Lopez. And with that, why don't we go to our fourth and final question, which really is what more information can staff bring to continue conversations about the role of choice in schools? So I don't know if anyone has any additional comments or questions in regard to that particular portion, but we can take them now. I do have a few. Okay, yeah, I'll go first. I think I'm just kind of curious about how the new zone process will impact kind of the enrollment process that families experience. I know someone during public comment brought up what happens for people who kind of enroll later in the process or maybe after the process, and kind of how will that affect their ability to kind of be in a zone, and could they be actually not, will they ever not have a spot within their zone? And just, I guess, if you could kind of talk a little bit towards that.
Sure, I'll give a response here. I think that makes a lot of sense as a topic, and I could say that we've been working, as the student assignment policy team, we've been working with our partners in the Educational Placement Center and the Department of Technology to plan out what the enrollment infrastructure, really what the enrollment process for families looks and feels like in the future. So that's a strand of work that we've begun and that really will take us to October of 2023, when the enrollment cycle first opens for the new zone-based policy. So I think it makes a lot of sense to bring that conversation to the ad hoc committee at a future date. And I guess in my initial thinking, that doesn't need to be, by the end of this school year, and that's a conversation we can have before the introduction of the new system. And then as far as things like how are we taking into consideration families who don't participate in the first round of school enrollment, we have had some of those initial conversations as staff, and we'll continue to have those. So thank you for raising that question, and we'll look for the right opportunity to bring our thinking back to this group.
Yeah, I would love if that could be something that comes up in a future presentation with the slides to address, and really thank the public for providing that comment. A follow-up, an additional question is, can families move into their zones if they kind of enroll before the zone period? Would there be any kind of flexibility for them to be able to do that?
Yeah, the way that we've been thinking about it so far is that families, have the option to apply to a different SFUSD school, at any point in their educational journey in SFUSD within the enrollment cycles of the EPC, right? So if a student enrolls and does kindergarten and first grade at a school, and then we introduce zones, that the student would have the opportunity to apply to a school different than the one they currently attend that's within their zone, right? In the same way today, any first grader is able to apply to a different school if they want to switch for second grade. But of course, that's dependent on there being space available at the school that they're hoping to transfer into. Does that make sense? So as we're introducing the new policy, we haven't envisioned a way to kind of like carve out extra spaces at non-transitional grades to let students kind of come back to school in their zone. But if that space exists in classrooms that they want to transfer into, then families will be able to do that.
No, I appreciate that clarity. So the existing process of transferring from schools will essentially continue, but families will be kind of locked into their zones. And so I think one important thing that I think I wasn't clear about, that I'll just restate to make sure I'm right, is that once we make this switch, all elementary school students are going to be locked into a zone. And so if they are outside of that zone, if they want to switch schools, kind of regardless of the reason, they would have to switch to a school inside their zone. Is that correct?
That is the way we're envisioning it right now. And I'll just kind of make sure that this is clear for the public. As we introduce zone boundaries, we will not force students to leave their school that is outside of their zone boundary. Students can continue to attend the school that they've been attending. But as you said, Commissioner Bogus, we're envisioning that if students do want to change schools after the introduction of zone boundaries, they would need to choose from the schools that are within their new zone boundary.
To follow up on that, in situations where a student has to do a safety transfer or a family has to do something like that, would we honor people's ability to maintain the same kind of program consistency, or would they actually kind of be forced to kind of go to a school in their zone, even if it didn't have the same kind of course offerings or program offerings?
Well, I'll say that we definitely want to strive to not disrupt students' program enrollment based on any changes to assignment policy or anything like that. So I'll say that. And I see Tammy has a hand up.
This particular, the elementary school assignment policy, and as well the comprehensive school assignment policy, don't contemplate safety transfers. That's a separate board policy. So those will be considered on a case-by-case basis. And of course, we are looking at supporting that individual's students' continuity and program needs based on whatever the reason might be behind the safety transfer.
Okay, so it's good to know that essentially staff would have discretion to kind of figure out the best way to kind of apply the policy to support families. But there isn't necessarily anything that families would be able to kind of expect in that situation, except that staff is going to kind of work with you to make it right. So I definitely appreciate that. I feel like I have been asking a lot of questions. Are there additional questions or comments from other commissioners or student delegate Lamb? Okay. I think the only other thing maybe I would add up is I do feel like this will have a positive impact on our enrollment. And I think definitely once people see zones that make them feel confident, it'll make people want to be a part of our school district, hopefully more. And I think that hopefully also will encourage people to enroll in schools earlier, right? And kind of engage in the process at the first moment it's available. I know that there were some people in public comment who brought up school start time, and there is, I do believe, an overlapping of those two issues, but I do think it is very complicated for us to kind of merge them together. So I would say if people are interested in talking about school start time, I'm not willing to necessarily talk about undoing the actions we have done, but definitely want to talk about how we can work to make things better. We just encourage folks to email me directly. And I definitely can make time to have conversations and figure out with the joint advisory committees, really kind of how we kind of continue to have a conversation about school start time and how it affects families and just how we can kind of continue to improve the processes that we have. I think that is the last thing I have to say. If there's no more comments from commissioners or student delegates, I don't know if there's any more comments from staff or announcements that folks want to make before we adjourn, but if not, we can adjourn this meeting now and wish everybody a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Evening.
Evening.